Welcome everyone to our first in the Europe Center series of talks this quarter. I'm delighted today to introduce Professor Sarah de Lange, who is a named chair at the Department of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam. She is published widely and cited very broadly in the fields of political competition and political parties, radical right parties, and populism. And she's one of the foremost experts on radical right parties, how they compete, and how they obtain electoral support. We're absolutely delighted to welcome her here. And today she will speak on a cross-national investigation into contextual effects and populist right-wing support. I ask that if you have questions to please use the Q&A function or the chat function. And so we'll hear Sarah speak, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. Thank you. Sarah?
Thank you very much for having me in your series today, and thank you for the kind words of introduction. I think this is a very timely moment for my presentation, only a week prior to the elections in the US. As you might recall, the election of Trump in 2016 really sparked a renewed interest in political geography. There were many scholars in the US who examined why the support for Trump was stronger in certain parts of the country than in others. And that interest also crossed into Europe, where scholars increasingly became interested in the uneven distribution of support for radical right-wing populist parties across the European continent. And what I'll be presenting today to you is a paper that is about that geographical distribution of support. It's part of a larger project that we have been working on at the University of Amsterdam. So my presentation will consist of two parts. I'll start out with a general overview of the project, trying to explain why we're interested in this political geography. And then I'll go into the paper itself. So if we look at the distribution of support for radical right-wing populist parties across Western Europe, we see that each country has its own geography. I've brought with me here three examples from the Netherlands, France, and Germany, where you can see the uneven distribution of support for radical right parties. So if we look at the Netherlands, the picture on the left, we see that the PVV of Geert Wilders is most strongly supported in the border areas of the country. So you see some light areas in the central areas of the Netherlands, but then in the south, the southeast, and the northeast, we see the highest support for this party. In France, we see quite a different pattern. We see two distinct regions in which the Front National of Marine Le Pen is particularly successful. We see one area in the southeast, around the Mediterranean, and then we see another area in the north of the country, which is an area that used to be strongly industrialized and where there's now a lot of unemployment. And then lastly, on your right, you see Germany, where the support for the AfD is most strongly concentrated in the east of the country. Now, what stands out from these three maps is that there are some similarities between these countries. We see, for example, in each of the countries that radical right-wing populist parties do not fare particularly well in the capitals of the three countries, in Amsterdam, in Paris, and in Berlin. But also that there's quite some differences in the geographical distribution of support for these parties. Some parties are successful in areas that have experienced economic hardship. Other parties are successful in areas where there is relatively high percentages of immigrants. But these are not uniform explanations for the support of these parties across these countries. A really well-known political geographer, Rodriguez Posse from the LSE, has said, well, what unites these different areas in which radical right-wing populist parties are particularly successful is that they can be considered to be places that don't matter. Places that are somehow not of interest to the economic, cultural, and political elite in the country, and that are somehow lagging behind. And we think that this is a very interesting idea and that it merits to be explored further. Now, if we look at traditional explanations for geographical patterns in voting behavior, we see two research traditions. So the first tradition assumes that differences in support for political parties, including differences in support for radical right-wing populist parties, can be explained by the fact that in different areas in the countries, there's different groups of citizens living in terms of their background characteristics, such as their age, their level of education, their income, their ethnicity, etc. So this trend in the literature assumes that the differences can be explained by composition effects of the population. A second approach that's often taken in the literature is that it's assumed that it's actually the contexts in which citizens live that impact on their attitudes, and that it is these contextual characteristics such as the number of migrants that live in an area, the housing prices in an area, the level of social cohesion in an area, that it's these kinds of factors that impact on citizens' attitudes and consequently also on their electoral behavior. So this is a tradition that assumes that we can explain these differences in political geography by looking at context effects. In our project, we're mostly interested in the second type of explanation because the first type of explanation has been examined quite extensively, and we know that composition matters. It matters in the US context and it matters in the European context as well. But we know relatively little about how context effects actually work. So how the environment in which you live influences your attitudes and your political behaviors. And existing research in this tradition is in a way quite unidimensional. It usually focuses on one specific contextual factor, for example, looking specifically at ethnic diversity, looking specifically at economic hardship, and links that to one particular kind of political attitudes or political behavior. So for example, looking at the relationship between ethnic diversity, xenophobia, and radical right-wing populist support. Or alternatively, looking at economic hardship, welfare chauvinism, and radical right-wing populist support. Moreover, the existing research often assumes that the relationship between contexts, attitudes, and behaviors is uniform across citizens, is uniform across the different contexts in a country. So it's similar, for example, in the countryside and in the big cities, and that it affects is linear. And then thirdly, the research that exists in this tradition often either looks at municipalities in a specific country, for example, looking at the effect of ethnic diversity in French cities and linking that to radical right-wing populist support, or looks at multiple European countries, but at a very high level of aggregation. So for example, looking at regions or provinces in different countries. And that is for the simple and practical reason that it's very difficult to get comparable data about low units, municipalities, or neighborhoods across Europe. Now, in our project, we want to address these shortcomings. What we want to do is, first of all, look at the more complex interactions between context, attitudes, and behaviors, but also examine the existence of these complex interactions from a multi-country perspective and at a very low level of aggregation. Because we know that the kinds of environments that inform citizens' attitudes are the kinds of environments that they experience on a daily basis. It's the neighborhood in which they live, in which they work, in which their children go to school, rather than a big municipality or even an abstract concept of a province, which they do not have an attachment in any way. So for this reason, we have a collaboration between 4 European universities, University of Amsterdam, where I am based, but also the University of Mainz in Germany, the University of Leeds in the UK, and the University of Nice in France. And we've selected these 4 countries and universities because we feel that these 4 countries represent very different kinds of political and party systems. And we therefore have sort of a most different cases design, right? If we find strong patterns in these 4 countries that are quite similar, we can assume that they also exist elsewhere in Western Europe. And the theoretical point of departure of the project is that we observe very similar outcomes in terms of radical right-wing populist support in what are otherwise very different contexts. So for example, we see that there's high levels of support for radical right-wing populist parties in these 4 countries in both urban and rural areas. But we also see that we have very different outcomes in terms of support for these parties in what are otherwise very dissimilar contexts. So for example, here on the screen, you see the 2 biggest cities in the Netherlands. On the left, you see Rotterdam, harbor city, and on the right, you see Amsterdam, capital city. They're both large cities. They have very high levels of economic growth. They're very open to international competition. They are very diverse in their composition. But in the one city, Rotterdam, radical right-wing populist parties have been very popular in the past years. Whereas in the other city, Amsterdam, they have been they've had very low levels of representation. And we want to explain why these two seeming paradoxes can emerge. And some of the steps that we've taken so far in the project is that in a number of papers, we have first of all shown that the contexts that influence citizens can be quite different across the country. So we have one paper in which we showed that while immigration is an important contextual factor in urban areas, it's actually local marginalization. So outmigration of younger citizens, declining access to public services, that explains that support in more rural areas. So we see 2 very different causal paths towards radical right-wing populist parties. We've also seen in our studies that how these contexts interact with attitudes really depends on the degree of urbanization. So the effect of context in urban areas that are densely populated is very different from the effect of context in more rural areas. And what we've also found in the studies that we've done so far is that although we often assume that the context that influences you is your own neighborhood in which you live, there's actually quite strong halo effects of the neighborhoods around you that also can affect your attitudes and your support for radical right-wing populist parties. So for example, if you're surrounded by neighborhoods with high concentrations of migrants, that will actually impact on your anti-immigrant attitudes and subsequently make you more likely to support radical right-wing populist parties. So this is what we found so far. And we're now working on a new paper which focuses on how contexts influence different kinds of citizens differently. So it's really a study about how mediation and moderation shape the relationship between contextual factors on the one hand and radical right-wing populist support on the other hand. And the model that we develop in the paper is the following one. The model assumes that there's 3 main contextual variables that are of interest when we want to try to account for the support for populist radical right parties. The first one is ethnic diversity, operationalized here as immigrant presence in the European context. The second one is economic hardship, and this can be economic growth in an area. It can be the level of unemployment. It brings together a number of economic factors. And the last one is this phenomenon of local marginalization that I already mentioned. So it's demographic decline, aging population, outmigration of younger citizens, etc. And we know from previous research on radical right-wing populist parties that these 3 contextual factors feed into 2 types of attitudes, namely nativist attitudes that focus on threat from immigration, and populist attitudes that focus on political discontent. And it's these 2 different attitudes that then feed into populist radical right voting. Now, our first claim in this paper is that the relationship between context and attitudes runs to something that has so far not been really observed in studies, which is perceived local decline. So these changes in your context, a rise in immigrant presence, a decline in economic growth, or an increase in unemployment, and decline in the percentage of young citizens in your area, can make you feel that your area, your neighborhood is not doing well, that it's developing in the wrong direction. So it's sort of a local equivalent of what we often study as societal pessimism, but in this case, very much focused on the area in which you live. And it's this evaluation that then feeds into these attitudes of nativism and populism, and subsequently populist radical right voting. Our second hypothesis, which is our second hypothesis, apologies. Our third and fourth hypotheses are about how the relationship between context, so immigrant presence, economic hardship, demographic decline, and perceived local decline are not identical for all groups of citizens. And in this paper, we look at two characteristics of citizens that we believe moderate this relationship between context and perceived local decline. So the first one is the embeddedness of citizens in their local area, right? Citizens differ in the extent to which they have an attachment to their local community, the extent to which they're rooted there, the extent to which they have strong ties to their local community. And we believe that if you have stronger ties to your local community, if you have a stronger attachment, then the effect of the context on your perceived local decline will be stronger. You will be more concerned about what's going on in your environment, and this will then feed into your attitudes. The second moderator that we think is important is your personal resources, because those determine the extent to which you can deal with these changes in your context. And resources, are, of course, can be manifold, but in this paper, we focus specifically on education. We know that education is important in studying the support for radical right-wing populist parties, but we also know that your education level has a big impact on how you deal with changes in your context, to what extent they unsettle you and make you insecure. And they also have a big impact on, for example, your mobility and your potential to actually move out of the area if you're really dissatisfied with the local developments. So these are our two hypotheses about moderating effects. Now, we study these hypotheses in a comparative study. So we look at the 4 countries that I already mentioned. So this is Germany and support for the AfD, France and support of the Front National, the Netherlands and support for the PVV, and then we also look at the UK and UKIP. And we study these 4 countries at the same moment in time, because in 2017, all of these 4 countries had national elections in the same year. So we have a very nice situation in which the international context in which these elections took place was by and large the same in these countries. And what we did is that we fielded geocoded surveys amongst a geographically representative sample of respondents. So for each of the respondents in the surveys, we have information about exactly where they live, so that we can connect their answers in the survey to information about the neighborhoods in which they live. And we stratified the samples in such a way that we have a good distribution of respondents over the 4 countries, because often what you'll see is that citizens in the most peripheral areas of a country will be underrepresented in regular samples, and we made sure by stratifying across municipal size and across region that we really capture the diversity in living environments in which citizens find themselves. And we tied these survey data to official data of the National Bureau of Statistics in the 4 countries to get information about these contexts at the neighborhood level. So we have reliable information about the presence of immigrants in these areas, about levels of unemployment, of the percentage of different age groups that live there, etc. And we then use two different kinds of methods to model the relationships amongst these factors, because we cannot study mediation and moderation in a multi-level context in one model alone. So we use structural equation models to look at the causal chain, so to look at the relationship between contexts, local decline, attitudes, and populist radical right voting. But structural equation models do not allow you to study also moderating effects. So to study the relationship or the effect of education and embeddedness, we actually look at multi-level logistic regression models. As I already indicated, the dependent variable is support for the four populist radical right parties that I already mentioned. And we have independent level variables at the context level, so at the level of the neighborhoods, unemployment, presence of immigrants, and demographic decline, which we measure as the percentage of youngsters in an area. And we also have independent variables at the individual level, so measured through the surveys. We have two batteries of questions that have been established in the literature that measure populist and nativist attitudes. We have a question about how citizens perceive the decline of their area. Embeddedness we measure as the attachment to the area in which they live, and we measure education level in the 4 countries. Now, I'll first present the results of the structural equation models, and then I'll present the results of the multi-level regression analyses. So what the structural equation models show, and you see here the effects for the different countries listed by country flag, is that there's indeed quite strong relationship between these 3 contextual factors and perceived local decline. There's an effect of immigrant presence, there's an effect of economic hardship, and there's an effect of demographic decline. And the effects of immigrant presence and economic hardship are most pronounced and most clear across the 4 countries. So there's an effect of significant effect of immigrant presence in all the 4 countries we study, and it's strongest in Germany and the Netherlands. Economic hardship also plays a role in 3 of the 4 countries, so in the UK, France, and Germany, but not in the Netherlands. And then the relationship between demographic decline and perceived local decline is much weaker. So there's not a significant effect in the UK or the Netherlands. There isn't a significant effect in France and Germany, but in the one country, the effect is positive and the other is negative. So it's really about immigration presence and economic hardship. Those are the 2 contextual factors that seem to be influencing how citizens perceive what's going on in their area. And then if we look at the second step of the model, which of course we modeled as one, but I presented here in 2 parts to make it visually more clear, we see that then perceived local decline feeds into both nativist and populist attitudes, and subsequently in populist radical right voting. And these relationships are quite robust across the 4 countries. So in each of the 4 countries, both play a role. So perceived local decline influences both populist and nativist attitudes. And the 2 also influence populist radical right support. And in each of the countries, it's clear that the strongest effect runs through the nativist attitude. So the perceived threat from ethnic diversity and migrants, and the route along the relationship along the line of populism and political discontent is somewhat weaker. Now, of course, we were not only interested in mediation in the effect of perceived local decline, but we also believed that that relationship between context and perceived local decline was moderated by education and embeddedness. So here's a figure that presents the results for education level. And what you see here is the effects for the 4 countries. sorted by contextual factors. So the first column shows you the effects for immigration presence, the second for unemployment, and the third for two different categories of age, namely the presence of youngsters from 16 to 24 and the presence of youngsters from 25 to 44. So this is sort of the age in which you settle and build a family, buy a house, etc. And the figures show the marginal effects of local decline, of context on local decline by education level. So, for example, if we look at the upper left figure, we see that there is a relationship between immigrant presence and perceived local decline, but that this relationship is only significant for the lowest educated, and it's no longer significant if we look at the highest educated. We see very similar patterns across the other countries. So also in France, Germany, and the Netherlands, the effect of local context on local decline is much weaker for the higher educated than for the lower educated. And we see similar patterns for unemployment and age. Now, the second variable that we were interested in was that of embeddedness, so the attachment to your local area, and there we see a similar pattern. So we also see that here there's a difference in the relationship in terms of attachment. It's significant in some cases, but not in all. So the relationship in terms of moderating is a bit more complex because it varies across countries, but there seems to be a relationship. Summing up, and I think I'm almost out of time as well. So what we find in this particular paper, and following up from what we found in the previous papers of the project, is that indeed feelings of local decline mediate the effect of context on populist and nativist attitudes and thereby on populist radical right support. We also find that of the three context variables, immigrant presence is the most important in terms of predicting populist radical right support, and in the meantime influencing perceived local decline and nativist and populist attitudes. But we also observe that this relationship is not equally strong for all citizens. So it is most importantly moderated by education level, with lower educated citizens being more strongly influenced by changes in their context than higher educated citizens. And I think this is something very important that we need to take with us if we want to understand the support of radical right-wing populist parties in Europe. That certain groups of citizens have a predisposition to support these parties because they're more strongly influenced by their context, the context in which they live, but also, for example, we know from other kinds of research by the political messages and media messages to which they are exposed. So in this respect, levels of education really predispose some citizens more towards the populist radical right than other citizens. Thank you very much for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah. If there are any questions, we have a Q&A function. So if you could go to that box and ask any questions, that would be great. Sarah said she was going to answer them, field them herself. But before we do, I actually had sort of, a broader question here. So I found, that this was a wonderful presentation. I'm so glad that you are really sort of, drilling down into both content.
Sorry, this goes with Zoom sessions.
So I have had small children come up and ask questions when I was giving a talk. So this is, cats are welcome. So I'm so glad that you're drilling into these contextual effects. I was sort of wondering if you could speculate about the mechanisms, right? So, when we say that, there's this predisposition to support parties that's mediated by the immigration levels and the economic and moderated by the economic hardship that's there. Does that sort of, is that exhibit itself in sort of sociotropic voting? My community is threatened. I'm worried about what their chances are, or is it much sort of self-oriented? I myself am threatened by immigrants. I am threatened by not having a job, etc. Because that sort of posits two different kinds of thinking about the impact of this context on voters, right? Is it sociotropic or is it individualistic, and how would we tell the two apart?
Well, of course, theoretically, it can be both. In our analyses, we of course also control for citizens' background characteristics. And thereby we can say a little bit more about what's going on. And we find that citizens with lower levels of education are more strongly influenced by their contexts, even when they're not affected themselves in terms of, for example, unemployment, low income, or other kinds of background characteristics. So I think this points towards a broader mechanism whereby citizens with lower level of educations could, for psychological reasons or for sociological reasons, have more difficulties to adjust to the changing context in which they find themselves, experience more insecurity as a result of this, are also aware that being lower educated, their social mobility is lower, so they have fewer opportunities to leave the area in which they live and seek opportunities elsewhere. So I think it could be many things that have to do with that, but of course we don't know the exact mechanism on the basis of these kinds of studies. I think to get more information about that, we actually need to do more qualitative research. So of course in the US, a lot of the interest in this topic was sparked by more anthropological studies, such as those of Kramer and Hochschild. But similar studies have not yet been conducted in the European context. Most of the research on political geography in Europe is actually quantitative.
Mm-hmm. So, and to you, I'm going to abuse my privilege. To reverse the question, do you have, even though this is outside of the scope of the study, do you have evidence of populist and nativist party leaders and politicians exploiting these contexts, right? Do they target these appeals to these contexts or just to types of voters?
So this is one of the reasons why we wanted to study radical right-wing populist parties in different contexts. Because the 4 countries that we're looking at are quite diverse in terms of how nationalized party systems and media systems are. So of course, Germany has a federal system, has quite strong local and regional party systems and media systems. Whereas the Netherlands, for example, is highly centralized. The Netherlands actually is one unified electoral district. There is no subdivision into electoral districts in the Netherlands. And the interesting thing is, I think that in this paper, but also in the other papers that we've written, is that we don't find very large cross-national differences. So this would suggest that perhaps it has not so much to do with what radical right-wing populist parties do or what more nationalist media actors do, for example, because then you would expect to be finding stronger differences between the countries. I would be happy to take some questions from the audience.
Absolutely. Ah, there we go.
Hi, Giuseppe, thank you for your question. So what does education stand for? Does it stand for skills in an economic sense? Does it stand for cognitive skills? I think this is a very important question because we know that education is such a strong predictor of radical right-wing populist support anyway, and also in this study as a moderator. We see it in this study as a resource. So we're more thinking along the lines of skills in this context. We also take a more sociological approach in the types of explanations that we're looking at. But I think that we also, as political scientists, should take into consideration that it can also be a psychological factor, that it can point at the way in which citizens process information, how they deal with uncertainty, etc. And this is something I think that has remained underexplored in the studies of the populist radical rights. But of course, we need altogether different kinds of studies to untie these two types of mechanisms. I don't think that is something that we can easily do with survey questions. And then your follow-up question about the availability of the project. Yes, we have some papers that have just been accepted for publication, so I'd be happy to share them with you after this session. Feel free to also ask me any more general questions you would have about radical right-wing populism in Europe. I would be very happy to answer them. A question from Nicolas Fuster. One is about Trump and how the election outcome in the US might influence radical right-wing populist parties in Europe. I think this is a very interesting question. In the media, there has been a lot of speculation that Trump's election in 2016 might have fueled the success of radical right-wing populist parties in Europe, especially because there were so many elections taking place in 2017, the year after that. I think his impact in that respect has been overstated. The success of radical right-wing populist parties had been ongoing for a number of decades already in Europe, and had been fueled by the refugee crisis. It's very clear if you look at the trajectory and polls of the different radical right-wing populist parties, but also at existing research that had an impact as a contextual factor. I think what Trump's election has done is that it has emboldened the extreme right in Europe, and that it also has made the dividing line between the extreme right, extra-parliamentary extreme right on the one hand, and the parliamentary represented radical right on the other hand, more diffuse. So we see more crossover, more collaboration between extreme right and radical right-wing populist movements. And we also see the emergence in the European context of typical, quote unquote, US-based extreme right movements like local branches of the Proud Boys, for example. My cat is not allowed to vote. And if she were to be allowed to vote, she would vote for more food, I think. Any more questions I could be answering?
Oh, hold on. Christophe says he's unable to answer a question.
Okay, so
yeah. See his question?
Yeah, I found the question from Christophe. So he asks that he points out that at least in one of the countries that we're studying, which is the Netherlands, there are two successful radical right parties. And he would like to know if the mechanisms that we identify work the same way for the two parties. I wish I could tell you that. We did this survey in 2017 when the PVV of Geert Wilders was still the largest radical right-wing populist party in the Netherlands. At that point in time, his party had been represented for a number of elections and had a sizable group in the parliament. The new radical right-wing populist party, the Forum for Democracy, entered parliament that year and only got 2 seats. And the number of respondents in our survey that actually supported the Forum for Democracy is too small to say anything about their characteristics and especially about their distribution over the country. So we simply have too few respondents of the FVD to say anything about how context influences their voting behavior. it would be very interesting to compare the two parties, because we know that Forum for Democracy is sort of an atypical radical right-wing populist party, in the sense that its supporters are on average a bit higher educated than is normally the case for populist radical right parties.
Okay. Then maybe if nobody else is asking a question, maybe I can ask a question also about Belgium. So you studied the countries surrounding Belgium. Have you looked at all at Belgium, and do you have any idea of what your conclusions would be there? Also, given the fact that if you look at economic decline, the decline in Belgium at least is mostly in a part of the country where the radical right is not doing well.
Yeah, I mean, Belgium in that respect is a fascinating story, because it has two different radical right-wing populist movements in the two parts of the country, so in the Flemish part and the Walloon part. And you would expect, on the basis of contextual factors, that the populist radical right would be stronger in Wallonia and weaker in Flanders, but it's actually the other way around. Unfortunately, we didn't have a Belgian partner in this project, so we can't say anything about how it works there. But of course, we do know from the existing literature that part of the explanation in Flanders and Wallonia doesn't have to do with demand side for radical right-wing populism, which is what we study here, but is actually on the supply side. It has to do with the organizational strength and the ideology of the radical right-wing populist parties that present themselves in the two parts of the country. The Flemish interest adheres to radical right-wing populism as an ideology. It's strongly organized, strongly rooted in society as well. Whereas on the Wallonian side of the divide, historically, radical right-wing populist parties have been quite weak in organizational terms, have had poor leadership, but also have found it difficult to really establish themselves, because the Socialist Party in Wallonia still encapsulates voters to a far greater extent than the Social Democrats in Flanders. So the Parti Socialist in Wallonia is a very traditional socialist party that is still very active in local communities, in terms of social housing, in terms of connecting to voters and really tying them into a very traditional socialist party structure. Whereas the Social Democrats in Flanders are far more modern social democratic party that have gone through a third way transformation in the late 1990s. And thereby have sort of freed up their electors and their supporters to be up for grabs for other political parties.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
I think we have another question in the chat. Let me see. So there's a question from Teresa about the geographical level that we look at. What makes us sure that it's the level that affects people? Most people travel across neighborhood borders for many reasons. You're absolutely right that the daily urban system in which citizens are active is more encompassing than the neighborhoods. Many citizens don't work in the neighborhood, for example, where they live, but it's very difficult to operationalize the daily urban system and measure the context characteristics of it, because it will be different for different kinds of citizens, right? So for some citizens, their work is very far away, so it encompasses a very large area, whereas for others, it might be very localized. We do know that the local context in terms of neighborhood is very important for citizens' attitudes. This has been established in other studies for a number of reasons, because people live there, they rent there, or they have bought a house there. It's usually also the neighborhood in which their children go to school. in which they shop for their daily groceries, in which they engage in social activities. So there is some literature that establishes that this is the most relevant context if you ask them about what they're thinking of. I should also mention that we do not define the neighborhood as a very, very small area. So these are still quite sizable areas, depending on the country that we're looking at, with sometimes even 1,000, 2,000 inhabitants in them. So it's more than a small block of streets. It's really the larger area in which citizens live, but it's under the municipal level. And then we have a question from Sebastian, asking me what I think that the COVID pandemic is doing for the support of radical right-wing populist parties in terms of the factors that we studied. So we do not see very uniform trends across Western Europe in that respect. So initially, at the start of the COVID pandemic, many radical right-wing populist parties lost some support as a result of the rally around the flag effect. So many radical right-wing populist parties in Western Europe are in opposition. There are very few parties that are governing at the moment, contrary to only 2 years ago. So because more voters supported governing parties and especially prime minister parties, this went at the expense of radical right-wing populist party. But the longer that the COVID pandemic has been going on, the more that we see a diversification of this trend. So depending on how national governments are doing, depending on how strongly the different European countries are hit by the socioeconomic consequences of the COVID pandemic, but also depending on to what extent other kinds of issues are still playing a political role, we see radical right-wing populist parties that are doing very well and radical right-wing populist parties that are doing very poorly. So to name only two extreme examples, the Front National, now called the Rassemblement National, is doing exceptionally well in the polls, but of course France is facing a number of terrorist attacks as we speak. And we know that this fuels the support of these parties, partly because it also influences the political agenda. In the Netherlands, on the other hand, the current debate is very much about the socioeconomic consequences of the COVID pandemic and about the capacity of the healthcare system. And here we see, for example, that the Forum for Democracy, the party that became the second largest in the European elections last year, has now actually lost almost all of its support in the polls and is down to only 4 seats in parliament. So we see very divergent trends. And I think the strongest divergence has to do with how the political agenda is structured. So we know that radical right-wing populist parties do very well when we're debating socio-cultural themes, immigration, identity, terrorism, security, European integration, and they fare much worse when we're discussing socio-economic questions. First of all, because they have quite a blurred agenda on this point, combining both left-wing and right-wing stances, but also because they're not seen as issue owners of these issues. They're not seen as particularly competent on socioeconomic issues. So it will really depend on how the political agenda in the different European countries develops in the coming months to see what the long-term consequences will be for radical right-wing populist parties. Do we have other questions from the audience? I would be happy to take some more. We have another 10 minutes.
You were so expansive and so beautifully organized in your case that you've answered all our questions. Sarah, like I say, I think we might wrap up a bit early, but Sarah, thank you so much. This was just a terrific presentation. It sounds like an amazing research project, and we're so grateful that you stayed up late and made the time to come to us here and to give this presentation.
Well, thank you all for joining me early in your morning. I hope this means that you're off to a good day of research. And please get in touch if you would like to correspond about this research project or receive any papers. I would be very happy to share them with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. Take care, everyone. Thank you
You're
for
very welcome. Thank you for having me and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye.